In this story, a nurse risks everything. She carries a veteran on her back through a burning hospital, and at dawn a black, classified helicopter lands just for her, silently changing her fate. Before you hear the full story, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more like this. Let's begin. The night shift dragged on, always demanding everything without asking. Valeria had learned to move with a mix of accuracy and care, like someone putting bandages on broken bones without letting the noise inside turn into outside panic. The city hospital, with its yellowed concrete walls and halls that smelled of old disinfectant and reheated coffee, stayed standing because of the quiet effort of people carrying heavy fatigue. Outside, the city was melting under a heat wave that made even the walls sweat. Inside, the generators, those mechanical hearts nobody noticed until they failed, were struggling, powering lights, monitors, and fans that were already near their limit. Valeria had finished her rounds. She reviewed Mrs. Mendoza's chart, made sure the post-op blood pressure stayed on track, soothed the teenager with a fractured shin who pretended he wasn't in pain, and adjusted a medication dose with the care of someone who knows one wrong decimal can steal a breath. When she handed the shift over, she paused in front of the intermediate care unit. The newborn in the incubator was breathing in that steady, perfect rhythm that, in small ways, felt like the victory of every night. She allowed herself a sip of cold coffee, leaned against the railing of the small interior balcony, and looked down the main corridor. The yellow emergency light at the far end flickered softly under the trapped heat of the building. Earlier, a warning had flashed on the administrative control panel. High load. Monitoring recommended. It wasn't the first time this week. Valeria had filed it away in her mind as one of the many small anomalies fixed with minor tweaks, breaker resets, or deep breaths when no other option remained. But that night the hum from the generators had a new underlayer, a vibration she could feel in the bones of her fingers when she rested her hand on the railing. The ceiling fan was swinging with an uneven rhythm, and then one of the corridor lights flickered longer than usual, followed by a softer blink in the records room at the end of the hall. It wasn't a power cut. It was a warning shadow, a faint, sweet chemical smell, like overheated wiring starting to sweat its insulation, slipped through the vents. Valeria frowned, set her thermos aside, and straightened with the controlled calm of someone who's read the signs before they become alarms. She took a few steps toward the wall with the emergency phone. Her hand brushed the cold plastic just as, from down the hall, a soft, dry pop echoed, followed by a tiny orange spark dancing over the metal surface of the door closing off the record's wing. The light wasn't bright yet, but it reflected on the wall like the promise of something beginning to burn from within. Valeria took a deep breath. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She went on alert. Her finger tensed over the alarm button, and her gaze, which a moment ago had been routine, now fixed on the fading and reappearing orange shadow, moving in tiny shifts as if something inside the metal was heating up from the core. The blast was more than a sound. It was like the building exhaled all at once and darkness took over. The fluorescent lights went out in a scattered pattern, leaving the hall soaked in dimness barely held up by the red blinking emergency indicators. The constant hum of the generators, which seconds before had been a dull background, faded as if someone had cut it off. Valeria felt the change in the air before she saw it. A damp heat coming from deep in the corridor, and a thin wisp of smoke sliding through the vents, carrying that metallic, slightly sweet smell she knew too well. The hospital alarm started wailing, a sharp sound that crawled into your bones and forced open the eyes of anyone who hadn't yet understood what was happening. "Fire in records!" Valeria shouted without thinking about tone as she sprinted down the hall. Her voice bounced off the concrete walls and hit the receptionist, who was already pulling her radio out with shaking hands. "Where?" the woman replied, breathing hard from surprise and the rush to start the evacuation protocol. "In the records wing. The panels overheated, the power went out, and flames are coming through the gap in the steel door. Activate the plan, And tell security to get the patients out of that area first. Valeria grabbed the radio a young nurse held out and pushed the button hard. Her voice was clear and sharp, like someone who couldn't afford confusion to win. The old fire doors creaked as the heat made them react. A couple of guards, already alerted by the alarm, ran toward the ends of the hallways with handheld flashlights, trying to coordinate clearing the closest rooms. A doctor came out of the ER pushing a patient in a wheelchair, his coat soaked with sweat as he barked orders. "Valeria, do you have a clear route? The emergency light doesn't reach there." "Down the main corridor and then the service stairs," she replied without wasting time. "Don't go through the west wing. The smoke is already rising." She tried to trigger the sprinklers in the records wing from the nearby control panel, but it didn't respond. An electric crackle ran across the board, and small sparks jumped from one of the buttons, flaring for a second before dying out with no effect. The fire, fed by papers, folders, and old wiring, was spreading fast inside the room. A bright orange glow pushed through the cracks, and the heat hit like an invisible wall when anyone got close. "Cut the main feed to that area if you can, even manually," she ordered. A technician ran toward the main panel with a flashlight hanging from his helmet. The backup generators were trying to take over, but the system was overloaded. The medical monitor screens flickered, some going dark for seconds before coming back with weak, shaky flashes. The mixed shouts of nurses, frightened patients, and maintenance staff formed a cacophony Valeria knew well. It was the sound of an emergency unfolding. She gritted her teeth, pressed a hand to her chest to slow her quick breath, and moved to help clear a stuck stretcher, pushing it hard into the side hall to make room for those coming out. "Here!" she yelled to a group of aides struggling with a gurney. "Use the service door. The main corridor is filling with smoke. Don't get hung up on details. Evacuate first. Ask questions later." A young resident tripped over a coiled hose and nearly fell. Valeria grabbed his arm firmly and straightened him. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah, it's just everything is moving so fast," he answered, voice shaking. The fire, now visible behind the record's door, seemed to have a life of its own. The heat made the metal ripple slightly at the edge, and a thick dark cloud of smoke poured out from underneath, crawling like a beast searching for breath. Valeria knew the situation could get worse in minutes. Smoke killed fastest, and the building, with old windows and open ducts, could let the flame jump into other areas. She moved a wheelchair patient toward the nearest exit, wrapped him in a damp blanket to protect him, and made sure his companion, an older woman with a headscarf, grabbed her purse. The metallic sound of heating pipes joined the alarm. A team of nurses was already directing patients toward the main atrium. One wore a blood-stained sleeve, with no time to change. Valeria, still watching the growing fire, understood that every second mattered. She couldn't keep doing it alone. She looked around and saw the mix of fear and determination on faces. The hospital, despite its failures, was responding with what it had. The noise was a constant tide. Alarms, urgent voices, stretcher wheels screeching, patients crying, and the distant rumble of pipes under heat. Valeria kept moving like an axis, aiming, pushing, calming. She had helped get an older woman with chest pain out, carried a feverish child, and told an aide to cover a patient's mouth with a wet blanket to cut down on smoke inhalation. The evacuation was happening with a mix of discipline and fear. "First those who can't move on their own," she kept saying while pointing, and still, smoke was starting to creep into the secondary halls. The fire in the records wing was no longer a distant threat. It showed itself in the orange light leaking through the door cracks, heating the air like an invisible hand. "Valeria, what do we do with the observation room?" asked Marco, a veteran nurse, holding the edge of a stretcher while trying to keep two teens together. "Get them out through the side entrance, not the main hall. The smoke is rising fast toward the atrium." "I'm going to check the intermediate care wing," she answered firmly. There was no time to hesitate, but something, a different sound, made her pause for a second. Just as she bent to help move a stretcher toward the emergency exit, a faint, rhythmic, clear sound slipped through the chaos. Knocks. Not the frantic banging of someone trying to get out, but 3 dry, measured taps, like someone trying to be heard without shouting. "Did you hear that?" said a young aide beside her, eyes fixed on the far end of the corridor where the 3 knocks came again, this time more insistent. The sound came from the direction of the intermediate care wing, from a door that had been closed and sealed for months under protocols most people barely remembered. Valeria stayed still. In the middle of an evacuation, it would have been easy to write it off as echo, a drag stretcher, a vibrating pipe, or someone hitting something by accident. But her instinct didn't let her. The 3 knocks repeated, followed by a silence heavier than the alarm itself. They came from behind a steel door with a security seal held by old tape and a faded label that read, "Intermediate isolation. Do not open without authorization." "Did anyone else hear that?" Valeria asked, still staring at the door. "Yeah. Sounds like someone's in there." "But that wing's closed," Marco replied, frowning as he looked at the seal, slightly warped by the heat outside, as if the emergency made him doubt what he thought he knew. The 3 knocks came again, this time with a longer pause after the third, like the person inside was catching their breath to signal more clearly. Valeria edged closer, dodging a hanging hose and the smoke seeping from above. The air felt heavy. The heat warped the emergency lights so they flickered unevenly. She crouched to inspect the seal up close. It was mostly intact, but the lower edge showed marks, as if someone had been knocking from inside for some time, trying to get attention. "Can we open it?" the aide whispered. "Not without knowing who's in there. If it's a false alarm, we can't scatter more people," Marco said, but his gaze softened. Something in the pattern of the knocks didn't sound like a prank or confusion. Valeria pulled the small flashlight from her belt and flashed the lock and surrounding area. No one had an extra mask to go into a sealed zone right now. All protective gear was tied up on the main exits. There was no time to wait for security if someone was trapped inside. She took a deep breath. Protocol said not to force sealed doors without authorization during a coordinated evacuation. But the 3 clear knocks were a desperate signal from someone who needed help. The sound had been so distinct her mind could replay it like a code. "Marco, open a channel on the radio so the rest of the wing stays alert. I'll check in there. If it's a patient, we can't leave them." Before he could answer, she pulled a small cutter from her pocket and carefully scraped at the edge of the seal. The tape creaked. She did it slow and measured, keeping her hands steady even though her heart was racing. The knocks came again, this time changed. Too quick, then a short pause, then a long one, like the person inside was trying to signal they were ready. Valeria felt a mix of fear and responsibility. She couldn't leave it. She eased the tool further until the seal gave with a whisper of tape and metal. The locking mechanism didn't move. The door was stuck from the inside. Another stronger knock echoed through the steel panel. "I'm opening it," she said, no longer asking. "Wait." Marco grabbed her arm. "What if it's a trap? If it's a trap, at least we'll know. If I don't try, someone's still in there." Valeria pushed. The first resistance made her hesitate for a moment, but the rhythm of the knocks and the faint sound of held breath beyond gave her the resolve to keep going. The hinge screeched, and a narrow crack appeared. The air that came out was cool, smelling of old medicine, and something that wasn't smoke from the fire, more like damp paper and a closed room. The next step was crossing that threshold to see who was inside, but she did it cautiously. 1 foot on the edge, flashlight ready. The door, still ajar, revealed dense darkness beyond. The crack in the door opened with a slow, whining creak. Valeria pushed carefully, holding the flashlight in one hand and using the other to keep the door just ajar. The air inside was thick, smelling like a closed room and old medicine, but not like fire. That gave her a second of relief and also of alertness. She stepped forward slowly, eyes fixed on the interior. The room was small and almost dark. Only 2 emergency lights flickering weakly, and the filtered glow from the hallway provided any light. On a stretcher, covered with a thin sheet, lay a woman. She wasn't clearly young or very old. Her graying hair was loosely pulled back, her skin showed faint lines, and her face was fading. She was unconscious. Valeria approached with controlled urgency. The admission tag clipped to the side of the stretcher showed very little. Name listed as Mrs. Rivas. No contact information, no full medical history, no family listed. She'd been brought in that same night in a rush. Her intake didn't show in the normal electronic records because the server had gone down with the outage. Valeria ran a gloved finger across her forehead, cold, damp with sweat, but she wasn't seizing. With a trembling hand from the rush, she pulled the sheet down slightly and felt for a pulse at the wrist. It was weak, but there. She was breathing, shallowly. Is she breathing? Valeria asked quietly, more to herself than to anyone. She knew Marco and the aide were still outside, watching from the doorway frame. Yes, but very weak, Marco answered, having slipped in silently, mask half adjusted, eyes full of concern. Any history? He added, looking at the tag. Valeria shook her head. Nothing. Just Mrs. Rivas. She arrived recently and was placed under observation before all this blew up. No family on record. She's in shock. Her breathing is low. She needs oxygen, but the main tanks are offline because of the outage. Marco muttered under his breath, almost unconsciously. What if we leave her here? There are people outside, and the exit that way is clearer for now. Valeria looked at him with sharp eyes. I'm not leaving her. Nobody gets left behind. If we leave her, we don't know if she'll last 5 more minutes. Smoke is already seeping through the door crack. If it rises, the room will fill fast. We have to move her, but I can't drag her alone in this condition. While they spoke, Valeria removed the old catheter and improvised a mask using a small resuscitation bag she found under the stretcher. She taped some tubing to make sure she got at least minimal air. She pressed on the woman's abdomen, firm, no sign of external bleeding. She opened the eyelids slightly, no response. Her hands were cold, but still had some give. Valeria clipped on a small portable monitor from her belt. The screen flickered with a slow, steady beep showing heart rate. Low, but there. It's going to explode out there, Marco said, pointing with his chin toward the hallway, where a brighter glow was already growing, like a living light behind the sheet of smoke starting to push in. The murmur of evacuees was fading, swallowed by the intensifying danger. I know, she replied. I can't leave her here to be overtaken by the fire. I have to get her out of this wing before the smoke takes her. But she's unconscious, and I don't have gear to move her on a stretcher without her falling. Valeria stood up, breathing controlled but fast. A loud crack echoed from afar. The fire was closer, and the heat on the room's side wall felt like a warning. She looked at Marco, then at the patient. Her gaze landed on the back of the woman's neck, on the contrast between the fragility of her body and the weight of the silence around her. Under that silence was a story not written on the tag, an untold life. It didn't matter now. What mattered was getting her out alive. Valeria adjusted the strap on her belt where a piece of tough cloth was tied and started thinking fast. How to lift the woman without hurting her. How to use her own body to shield and carry. How to move through debris and smoke already creeping in. She knew there was no time to build anything elaborate. The decision formed. The next move would be to carry her herself, with whatever she had, risking the full weight while dodging falling pieces and the spreading smoke. Valeria didn't hesitate. She took a deep breath, slid her hand under the woman's shoulders, and with a quick but careful movement rolled her up onto her back. Years in the ER had taught her to use her body as a tool. The old woman, barely held by her weak pulse, was secured with Valeria's arm crossed in front and one of the makeshift straps from her uniform tied around the waist, so she wouldn't slip. It wasn't a professional harness, but there was no time for better. The weight of Mrs. Rivas settled into Valeria's tight muscles, and that weight, heavy as it was, had become a mission. "Hold on," Valeria whispered, more to herself than to the unconscious woman. Marco and the aide watched for a moment, then without words cleared a path. The alarm kept screaming, a high, sharp wail competing with the crackle of distant fire. Smoke crept under the door and was already tinting the hallway walls gray. The heat hit like a wall with every step, and orange glows reflected in the sweat running down her forehead. Valeria moved forward with a steady, determined stride toward the east wing, which, while not yet aflame, showed signs of damage. Broken ceiling panels, hanging wires, dust rising in clouds with each footfall. "Do you think she'll hold?" Marco yelled, shining his flashlight over the loose debris as he followed. "She has to," she replied, gritting her teeth so the weight wouldn't show. "If she falls, there's no coming back. Clear the way. Move what you can." The first stretch was manageable, but soon they hit obstacles. An overturned stretcher blocked a corner. Valeria twisted sharply to avoid it, feeling small splinters dig into her back from the friction. The smoke thickened. Her eyes burned despite the mask. The increasingly hot air seared her throat with every forced breath. Ahead, a blinking orange light, reflection from the fire advancing in another wing, flickered like a warning. They reached a section where the ceiling had cracked and part of a collapsed duct hung low like a heavy tongue. Valeria had to crouch, almost crawl, to keep it from falling on them. The weight on her back forced her to move with careful slowness. One wrong step could make Mrs. Rivas slip, and lowering her there would expose her to the smoke already seeping in through side cracks. For a moment she thought about yelling for help, but she knew everyone was occupied, and any pause could cost lives. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the dry creak of the floor under her boots. "Valeria, do you see anything ahead?" Marco asked, sweeping the corridor with his light. "Over there, at the end," she answered, nodding with her chin. "I see a service exit, but it's lower. The ramp? It's partly collapsed. If we go down there, maybe we get outside. But it's unstable." They approached carefully. The service ramp, once narrow and solid, now showed damage. Twisted railings, chipped concrete, and a central section that had sunk, forming a tilted wedge. Steam rose from its base, like broken pipes breathing out accumulated heat. Smoke swirled below, making the air smell of hot metal and burned dust. Valeria glanced back. The fire was closer now. The low rumble of the structure expanding in the heat was growing. There was no safer path. Despite how hard it was, the east wing was the most likely route out. "I'll go first, you cover," she told Marco, placing a foot carefully on the edge of the ramp. "I've got you," he replied, adjusting his mask and moving in to help without getting in the way. Valeria started down slowly. The ramp groaned under her and the woman's combined weight. Every step was a calculation. Not too fast to unbalance the load, not too slow to let the smoke catch up. Losing balance would be deadly. A loose chunk of concrete fell, forcing her to lean forward to keep her center. Marco held the light so she could see, and with his other hand made sure Mrs. Rivas didn't shift. The heat below intensified. The damp air clung to her skin like a heavy layer. "Almost there," Valeria murmured, her voice ragged with fatigue. "Just a little more." The ramp wasn't built for two people carrying that kind of load. Her right foot slipped slightly on a wet patch. She tightened her muscles, corrected quickly, feeling the old woman's weight pull her forward. A sudden metallic crack sounded behind them, a heated bar bending, sending a vibration through the floor that made them both blink. Smoke began swirling denser, moving in from the rear entrance. Valeria spotted a faint light ahead. a gap into a secondary corridor that wasn't yet on fire. If they could get past this section, there was a short stretch left before the exit. The descent was a test of balance, strength, and holding her breath. Every inch was a decision. Lean forward, keep Mrs. Rivas from sliding, avoid a loose piece of concrete, dodge hanging wires that were sparking lightly, and push through a cloud of smoke that was already burning her throat. Marco was right behind her, shining the flashlight where they stepped, and using his shoulder to push aside loose debris so there were no hidden traps. Oxygen was thin in the air, and the effort made Valeria's breathing sound through her mask like an overworked engine. When they finally reached the last section of the ramp, the sound of the fire fell behind them for a few seconds. The lower structure creaked with each step, a deep groan warning that some parts wouldn't hold much longer. Valeria placed her right foot down carefully, then the left, feeling the ramp vibrate under her weight and the weight of the woman on her back. One by one, the emergency lights still flickering above the exit reflected in the sweat running down her forehead. The smell of burning mixed with damp earth and dust, and when the edge of the ramp ended, a cold, pure breeze hit their faces. It was outside, a breath of air that wasn't heavy with heat or that thick, oppressive stickiness. Valeria put a foot off the final step, took a firm step, and let momentum carry her the rest of the way down with extreme care. Marco helped steady her as they set Mrs. Rivas onto a flatter, almost improvised platform. A folding stretcher that two aides had dragged up under orders from someone coordinating outside. The fire glowed behind them, an orange wall that couldn't reach them for the moment, and smoke flowed like a dark river behind the collapsed structure. What had started as a rescue inside dangerous walls was now in a more open space where the air didn't burn as sharply. "Bring her in quickly," one of the aides called, while two others carefully lifted the patient off Valeria's back. Valeria dropped to her knees on the dusty ground, breathing hard, her heart pounding like it wanted to break free. Marco knelt beside her, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Good work," he said, without big speeches. "You got her out. That's what matters." Mrs. Rivas was placed on the stretcher. One of the paramedics who had arrived with a makeshift support unit stepped forward, checked her vitals quickly, and fitted a small oxygen mask over her face. Her chest rose and fell, still weak, but there was a response. Valeria tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her to lean back. The effort had drained her. A nurse on duty, who hadn't been visible in the earlier chaos, offered her a portable oxygen tube. She took it almost automatically, pressing the mouthpiece to her nose to pull in cleaner air. "You okay?" the nurse asked, looking at her pale face. "Give me a second," Valeria replied, closing her eyes for a moment as the air filled her lungs. She's alive. She was about to get trapped. The paramedic checking the new patient looked up at Valeria with a mix of respect and caution. "Who brought her?" he asked. "Me," Valeria said, her voice loosening. "She's unconscious, but stable for now. She needs a deeper evaluation." As Mrs. Rivas was moved away from where most people were being brought out the main entrance, Marco helped Valeria to her feet. Her legs trembled from the effort, but the relief of seeing the patient safe gave her a little extra strength. Someone draped a sheet over her shoulders to shield her from the sudden chill of the night. A flashlight beam hit her face and she saw, in the distance, the rescue operation still going. Muted sirens, voices giving orders, and a mix of exhausted people breathing more deliberately than before. Valeria's vision was still blurred from fatigue. She knew she had to keep going, check on the patient, report. But for the first time that night, she let her body feel the exhale. Her hand brushed the stretcher holding the old woman, watching the paramedics briefly discuss the route to move her to a safe, separate area, away from the main flow, where they wouldn't mix her with the others exiting the primary entrance. "Thank you," a voice whispered near her ear. It was Marco. "Not many people would have done what you did." Valeria nodded without saying anything. She watched them move away with the stretcher. Mrs. Rivas was no longer on her back. They had taken her toward a quieter care zone, intending to stabilize her quietly while the rest of the hospital worked on controlling the fire. Valeria stayed a moment, holding the oxygen tube, trying to get her breathing back under control. The air outside the burning wing felt like a warm rescue. Valeria was carefully guided to an improvised tent where they laid her on a folding stretcher. They gently took off her mask and put a smaller oxygen mask on her, the kind used in emergencies to give quick, simple air. Each breath made her feel a little more real, less like her body was on autopilot. The shaking in her legs didn't go away completely, but for a moment she stopped hearing the distant sirens and the creaking of structures. The smoke no longer burned her throat as sharply. She was inside a bubble of controlled breathing and relative quiet. "Breathe slowly," said a new nurse who had come from the main entrance. Her uniform was wrinkled, her face dust-marked, but her eyes were clear. "You look pale. Don't move until someone says you can." Valeria nodded, her hand still on her side, feeling the built-up tension ease bit by bit. Marco stayed beside her for a moment, saying little. He just gave her a squeeze on the shoulder. "Good work, really," he said quietly. "It wasn't just me," she replied, her voice rough. "Everyone's doing their part." From a distance, through the entrance, she saw a small team of paramedics carrying Mrs. Rivas on a stretcher covered with a gray sheet. They weren't taking her toward the main emergency area like the others. They were moving her down a side hallway, opposite to where most evacuees were being gathered. Their steps were measured, almost quiet compared to the general chaos. One of them, passing the tent where Valeria rested, gave her a quick look. He didn't say anything, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't just thanks. It was contained caution. "Where are they taking her?" Valeria asked, her mouth barely strong enough to form the question. The paramedic pushing the stretcher paused slightly and answered without fully stopping. "To a place to stabilize her privately." "That's it. You rest." His tone was firm, carrying an order that wasn't meant to be questioned. Valeria wanted to ask more. Why were they taking her away? Why not with the others? But the nurse giving her oxygen stopped her with a small gesture. "Don't push," she whispered. "Your body already did what it needed to. Let the others handle that." She closed her eyes for a moment and let the night breeze brush her face. A mix of relief and confusion sat in her chest. She had helped get that woman out, and now she watched her go in a different direction, as if she mattered more than the rest. She didn't understand why, but the fatigue dulled sharper thoughts. Beside her, a folded piece of paper with a small notebook and pen had been handed over. Someone had written on one line, "You need to report. Later. Don't move yet." The handwriting matched the shift director's, though there was no signature. Valeria shifted her gaze to the figure carrying Mrs. Rivas away, then back to her own chest, feeling the air burn less. The staff began to reorganize. Some were outside treating minor injuries. Others were getting radio instructions. The hospital didn't stop. It adapted. Marco stayed a little longer to make sure she had coverage, then was sent elsewhere to help reposition incoming staff from the central wing. Valeria heard distant voices, thanks, commands, questions without clear answers. No one spoke to her directly about the woman being taken. No one explained why she wasn't with the others or what private really meant in this case. For the first time since it all began, the night's edges started to soften. The exhaustion ran deep, but her mind, between the low whistle of oxygen and the tense, quiet murmur, tried to piece together an image. The patient with the incomplete name, the opposite route, the brutal effort she herself had made. She didn't know what would come next, but in that moment her body asked for a pause. Her instinct kept her alert to any change, even though the voice inside whispered that everything else could wait a little longer. The night had slowly faded into a quiet early morning. The smoke didn't feel as close anymore, but the hospital showed visible scars. Some walls were stained with soot, equipment had been moved. Makeshift rooms were set up for minor injuries, and there was a low, steady hum of people still getting organized. Valeria, with a sheet draped over her shoulders to keep the cold out, had been moved into a small room by the main entrance. They told her to rest, not to move, to wait for someone to check her again. But her body remembered everything. The oxygen still felt like a presence in her throat, fatigue weighed like stones in her shoes, and her mind was stuck between relief and the unease about where they had taken Mrs. Rivas. Morning light came through the high windows, spilling pale sun over dust-stained sheets. The hospital was filling with a different kind of activity than the night. Technicians were checking the generators to prevent new failures. A dozen doctors were doing quick rounds while coordinating by radio, and the previous shift's director, who had been away for a few minutes, returned holding a notebook, her face tight. Valeria caught pieces of conversation. The transfer was discreet. She's not mixed with the others. National Defense already has it on their radar. Don't report it through regular channels yet. She didn't understand everything, and the fatigue made her brain grab only fragments, but she felt a shadow. Whatever had happened the night before was being watched more closely than normal. Suddenly, a deep sound began to fill the air. A low, sustained hum no one expected during the morning reorganization. At first, some thought it was a heavy machine, but soon it was clear it came from above, growing and cutting off conversations. The noise was metallic, steady, and vibrated in the chest of anyone who heard it. People paused, as if the sound had put them on hold without asking. After a few seconds, a shadow fell over the top of the building. Something large and black moving with intent. A black helicopter descended onto the roof like an unannounced presence. It had no visible logos, no hospital marks, no open government insignia. The sliding doors of the upper monitoring area flung open as the wind from the rotors whipped the clothes of those watching. The aircraft landed with sharp precision. The blades kicked up dust and loose papers from documents still unsettled from the night before. The sound rolled through the hallways like a drum, and the staff, still recovering, tensed. A security guard outside, having coffee, looked up, hand going to his radio. "What is that?" he whispered, while another security member ran toward the service elevator to alert. "It shouldn't be here without warning," said the director, now standing in the main corridor with a senior nurse. Her expression hardened. "Call them, ask what they want, and bring Valeria." The order dropped without drama, but with the firmness of something that couldn't wait. The helicopter's rotors slowed, as if silence followed the shock. Two men in dark vests and sunglasses stepped down first, alert, walking with controlled pace. Seeing them, the nearby staff realized they weren't part of the usual emergency medical protocol. A third person, wearing a jacket with no labels, followed a few steps behind. No one approached right away. There was a cautious respect mixed with curiosity. The guard who arrived out of breath had a phone in hand, speaking quietly to someone, while another staff member hurried to find Valeria, who still sat with eyes half open, holding the oxygen mask. "Who are they?" Marco whispered from beside her, staying low so he wouldn't disturb her, but watching closely. "I don't know," the director replied, "but they want to talk to her. Tell her to come calmly. Don't drag her. Escort her." Quick footsteps came. A young nurse gently touched Valeria's shoulder. "Valeria, there are some gentlemen up there who want to talk to you." His voice tried to sound normal, but the uncertain shine in his eyes showed how alert he was. She got up with effort, oxygen mask in one hand, the other on the stretcher edge to steady herself. She walked with unsteady but determined steps toward the spot where two of the men were standing near the elevator shaft that led to the roof. There was no warm greeting or formal introduction. The two men stopped and looked her over closely, without smiling. One gave a small hand signal for her to come forward. The third figure stayed a step back, arms crossed, scanning the area. The three men didn't say a word in the hallway. One walked ahead with measured steps, the second to the right watching Valeria closely, and the third a few steps behind, taking everything in with a cold calm. People moved around them like they were a shadow you didn't touch. When they got closer, the director gave a brief nod and stepped aside without asking. Marco tried to follow for a few steps, but one of the men raised a hand without turning back, and that gesture was enough to make him stop. They gave Valeria a barely noticeable smile, no warmth, and a man in a dark suit said quietly, "Come with us. We just want to talk." There was no question, no invitation. "What is this about?" she asked, still feeling the weight of the night in her legs. "I just finished a shift. I'm barely recovering. There's no time for explanations now. Let's go." The man in front took her by the elbow with a firm, but not violent grip. They led her to a service elevator. The doors closed with a dull clack, and it began to rise. The air inside was thick, smelling of metal and old disinfectant. Valeria tried to look at the other two, hoping for a clue about who they were, but their faces showed nothing, dark glasses hiding any expression. "Where are you taking me?" she pressed, breathing a little harder, still confused. "To a safe place," the man in the suit replied, without detail, without hesitation. "Just answer the questions they ask, and don't move until they tell you." The elevator stopped with a small jolt. The doors opened onto a narrow, windowless hall lit by cold ceiling lights. The carpet muffled their steps. The door at the end opened silently, and they brought her into a small, almost empty room. A table, 3 chairs, a flat screen turned off on the wall, and a discreet camera in the upper corner. The only light came from a soft source behind the screen. The door closed slowly behind them, and a click of the lock sounded. "Sit," said the third man in a low voice, pointing to the chair in the center facing the screen. Valeria obeyed, sitting carefully, her muscles still tight from the shock. One of the men placed a closed briefcase on the table, opened it with careful movements, and took out a thin folder without showing her anything. Silence filled the room for a few seconds, heavy, as if they were waiting for her to speak first. "What's your name?" asked the deep-voiced man, not looking up from his notebook. "Valeria Ramos," she answered, the name coming out guarded. "Nurse! Night shift." The second man, the one beside her, set up a small tripod with a portable camera and hooked it to the screen. He didn't speak, just signaled for the other chair to remain empty. He stayed behind the camera, watching Valeria's reaction. The first man, who had guided her in, leaned forward slightly. "We want to understand better what happened last night," said the one who had spoken first. "Don't worry about anything else. Just tell us what you saw." Valeria took a deep breath. Her hand trembled a little, not from direct fear, but from the buildup of adrenaline and exhaustion. "I went to evacuate, heard knocking on a sealed door, found the unconscious patient, got her out with Marco's help, and we brought her down the collapsed ramp," she began, and paused when one of them placed a hand on the table as a signal to stop. "We don't want you to tell it yet," interrupted the third, in a calm but firm voice. "We're going to show you something first." The screen turned on with a low hum. The light grew, and for a moment the glare blurred Valeria's vision. A blurry image appeared, a hallway in the hospital at night. The camera angle was exactly the corridor where she had been, with the faint emergency light flickering. The silence in the room grew heavier. None of the 3 men spoke. Valeria tilted her head, unsure what they expected her to see. The screen stayed lit with a soft glow for a few seconds, as if waiting for Valeria to settle. Then the image came alive. The angle was from a fixed camera in the main hallway, near where she had decided to turn. The recording showed the darkness of the previous night, the emergency light flickering, shadows moving quickly, the moment she arrived with Marco, the sealed door opening slightly with the strength she used, and then the instant she leaned inside. The 3 men stayed completely silent, no comments, as if the camera was evidence and the room was a courtroom with no jury. Valeria saw her own reflection on the screen. Thinner, face drenched in sweat, eyes focused. The sequence continued. Her entry, the quick check of the patient, the quiet, urgent gestures, how she adjusted the makeshift oxygen mask, her decision to carry the old woman on her back, and the descent down the collapsed ramp. There was no dramatic editing or music. It was real, raw, slow when the weight made her body strain, and quick in the small corrections that kept Mrs. Rivas from falling. Marco appeared behind, helping with the light, their ragged breaths mixing with the creaks of the concrete. The video didn't show the end of the ramp, only the border between the broken interior and the exit opening like a promise of clean air. Valeria felt a knot in her throat. Seeing her own effort like that unembellished reminded her of the tension in every muscle. "That's it," said the man who had spoken first in a soft voice. "We want you to tell us what you saw and what you were thinking in the moment. Don't repeat it. Explain why you did what you did." Valeria sat up a bit in the chair. The fatigue still weighed on her, but the memory of the action brought clarity. "I heard the knocks," she began, her voice held tight. "The door was sealed. I couldn't leave someone inside if they were asking for help. I went in because I thought someone was trapped. I found her unconscious, no history, and her condition was getting worse. There wasn't time to wait. I put her on my back, and we went down the ramp. I didn't know anything else until we got out." The second man, the one behind the camera, made a quick note in a small notebook. He didn't look up. "Was anyone else with you inside that wing?" the third asked, without changing his expression. Marco was behind, helping with the light. "No one else. I didn't ask for permission, I know. But there was no time," she replied. There was a short silence. The screen showed again the part where she was adjusting her step on the ramp. It showed her foot slipping slightly and how she corrected her balance without stopping, her body holding steady under the weight of the old woman. The recording ended with the angle filling with light as they crossed the final threshold, then cut with a small jump before showing the stretcher in other hands. The screen froze on the last image. Valeria leaning forward with Mrs. Rivas secured on her back, and behind them the evidence that the fire had chased them almost to the edge. "Your action was clear," said the first, leaving the sentence open, without more explanation. "Did anyone give you instructions about what was in that room?" Valeria shook her head firmly. "No. No one told me anything. I just heard the knocks. Everything else was instinct." The man with the notebook stopped writing, and for the first time one of them looked her directly in the eyes. "Good," said the third. "We're missing some details. We're going to ask you more. But first you need to know something important about the woman you carried." The man who had spoken first leaned in slightly, and in a softer but still firm tone, began to speak. "The woman you helped is not a regular patient," he said. "She wasn't an unnamed elderly case in the system. She was part of an intelligence unit. Retired. In protective custody." Valeria stared at him, as if the sentence needed to land inside her. "What do you mean by protective custody?" she asked, her voice still tight from exhaustion and held adrenaline. The second man, who had been quiet until then, exhaled softly and continued. "Her real name is sealed. Her past, her former identity, and her location were changed years ago. She worked behind complex networks, shutting down operations that threatened the stability of multiple countries. She retired under a program that hid her from people who would still look for her if they knew where she was. Your rescue triggered something unexpected. That's why it was done quietly. That's why she wasn't moved like the others." The word program hit Valeria like a cold wave. The pieces began to fit with the feeling that what she'd seen the night before wasn't just an accident. The way they moved her in silence, the side corridor, the distance. Now she understood there had been a reason for all that care. "Then why didn't you tell me before?" she murmured, not accusing, but trying to organize what she was hearing. Her mind was still trying to anchor the new information. I only saw her unconscious. I didn't know anything about her past. The third man, the one who had stayed furthest back, spoke with a neutral voice. Because what you know so far is enough for what we need. The rest will come in time. He didn't give more detail. She was in a place where she shouldn't have been seen, and your action changed how her transfer was going to be handled. That gives us new questions. Valeria swallowed. Silence filled the room for a few seconds again, but it was no longer the uneasy quiet from before. It was a space where something was slowly settling into her understanding. Mrs. Rivas wasn't a lost old woman. She was someone with a dangerous past who, in some way, had been protected the previous night by Valeria's decision to help. The man with the notebook looked at her for a moment and nodded. We know they didn't lay it out for you. We're not asking you to know everything now. We just had to make clear that this wasn't an ordinary case. Your action carried weight, and that's why we brought you here. Valeria kept her eyes on the frozen image in her mind. Herself climbing the ramp with the woman on her back, the fire behind them, and then the tense calm of getting outside. Her body no longer only felt exhaustion. It began to feel the jolt of knowing she had touched something much bigger. Outside, somewhere, the hospital kept its slow rhythm of repairs and unanswered questions. Inside that room, the explanation had shifted. There was a key piece still missing. What did rescuing that woman mean for her, and what consequences would that action have for her own life? Valeria opened her mouth, ready to ask the obvious question burning in her throat, but held back for a second, waiting to see if any of the men would add more. Valeria felt the information fall on her like a slow rain that first confused and then soaked her. The line that the woman wasn't ordinary didn't match anything she had faced before. The weight of the moment made her feel small, but also forced her to understand. So, without beating around the bush, she asked what was burning in her throat. "And what about me?" she said, looking at the three of them. "Am I in trouble for rescuing her? For going in without permission?" The first man watched her for a second, measured his words, and replied in a neutral tone. "We can't tell you more." "Is that it?" Valeria shot back, her voice tired but searching for something to hold onto. "Isn't there something I should know to protect myself? Or to know if I did something wrong?" He leaned back slightly against the table, showing no anxiety or surprise. The man with the notebook stopped writing and looked at her with controlled calm. "Your action was necessary. That's what matters for now. We understand you have questions. Answers will come in time. For now, follow your routine, stay available, and don't share details with anyone outside this room." The third man finished the instruction in a firm voice, like someone laying down a rule without needing to explain why. Valeria closed her eyes for a moment. The uncertainty twisted in her gut. She wanted to push, to get more, to know if her life, her job, or her safety were at risk. But the way they said it made pushing feel like stepping into ground they weren't offering. "Can I at least know if I'm going to be investigated?" she asked, shaping her worry into a question. "We can't tell you more," the first repeated, almost mechanically. "For now, do what you're told. That's all." A tense silence followed. The three men watched her a bit longer, as if assessing her reaction. Then one of them stood. "You can go," he said. "Someone will escort you back. Stay in touch." Valeria stood carefully. The fatigue was still in every muscle, but the tension had returned. She didn't know if it was from what had happened, from what they hadn't told her, or from the feeling that something else was moving out of sight. They led her down a hallway without more words. They left her in a small break room and told her to stay until someone came. They didn't send her back to her area directly, nor gave clear instructions about what to report first. She sat, gripped the pen in the notebook still on her lap, and let the silence settle into her like a warm shadow. During the day, she tried to get back to normal. She reported some basic facts, signed a couple of forms they asked for without reading closely, and answered with one-word replies when a few colleagues asked if she was okay. The phrase, "we can't tell you more," echoed in her head in a loop that wouldn't let her quiet down. She had done something big, but no one told her why, and she wondered what the real cost of that rescue was. She thought of Mrs. Rivas, her silence, her weight, her face that had shown no reaction. What made her so important and so dangerous? And what level of secrecy was being protected? The afternoon passed slowly. Valeria sat watching the hallway from the window of the room, seeing how hospital activity normalized bit by bit, but with a different energy, like someone was guarding an invisible boundary. At night, when natural light faded and the noise quieted, her phone buzzed softly on the table. It was an unknown number. The screen said hidden number. For a moment she hesitated, thinking about the three men, the warning not to share details, and the feeling of being in a game where she didn't know the rules. Night fell with a different kind of quiet than before. It wasn't the cut-off noise of alarms or the constant crackle of fire. It was a silence full of questions that never fully formed. Valeria was in the small break room when her phone buzzed again. It was late, the lamp light was low, and exhaustion sat on her like a damp blanket. She looked at the screen with a mix of distrust and curiosity. Hidden number, it said. For a few seconds she hesitated. She remembered what the men had said. Don't share details with anyone outside this room. She didn't know if answering was a mistake or something she had to do. She took a deep breath, hit accept, and put the phone to her ear. On the other end came a soft, low voice, without strange echoes, but it sounded very close, like it had passed through a wall without opening it. "Valeria?" the voice asked. It was female, calm, with no hurry, but carrying quiet gratitude. Her heart sped up a little. "Who is this?" she said, trying to hide the tremor in her throat. There was a short pause, like the person was choosing words. "Thank you for not leaving me behind." The sentence was simple and direct. No name, no request. Just, "Thank you for not leaving me behind." Valeria stayed silent for a few seconds, gripping the phone like a rope in the fog. "Are you okay?" she finally asked. "Who are you?" "I'm okay," the voice replied with a soft exhale. "I'll be okay because you acted. That's all I needed to say for now." A tiny sound, like a light click, came from the background. Then the voice added, "Don't say anything yet. Just remember what you did." Before Valeria could answer, the line went dead. Silence came back, but this time it was filled with a strange mix, relief, confusion, and a weight squeezing her chest. She looked at the number again. It was still hidden number. She tried calling back, but the call didn't connect. It rang once and then was dropped without explanation. She leaned back in the chair. Her mind started replaying everything. The voice, the tone, the calm that felt more like someone grateful than someone in immediate danger. Was it the woman she had carried? Was it someone else who knew what happened? She thought about the paramedic who had seen her take Mrs. Rivas in the opposite direction, and how no one had explained why the transfer had been secret. The thanks came with no explanation, but the message was clear. Someone knew she had made a risky, valuable decision. A few minutes passed, and Valeria stood up carefully. She walked to the narrow window overlooking the inner corridor. The light in the hall was dim. A few nurses moved with measured steps, and the night shift routine carried on as if the day's tension didn't weigh. She set the phone on the table, staring at the screen with her fingers resting near it. She wanted to tell Marco, but she knew don't share details included things like this unless someone explicitly asked. Still, she kept feeling that behind that "thank you" there was a name, a presence that wasn't going away easily. She couldn't sleep. Every odd sound made her turn her head, waiting for another voice. She stayed awake until the early dawn began to push back the night's shadow. Sitting with the notebook open on her lap, and the pen still. She wrote on a page, "Call from hidden number." Female voice, "Thank you. Don't ask yet." She closed the notebook, set it aside, and finally, body still tense, closed her eyes for a short time, allowing herself just a brief rest. The sun had fully set, and activity in the hospital had a different rhythm. Less visible chaos, more careful movement, like everyone was breathing with the awareness that something big had happened and still wasn't fully understood. Valeria sat in a small room, the notebook closed beside her, night damp on her skin. She was trying to sort her thoughts when the door opened quietly. The director came in without a loud announcement. Her expression was serious, with a mix of respect and a contained urgency that didn't need volume to be felt. "Valeria," she said firmly, coming closer and setting the folder she carried on the table. "I need you to give me your attention for a moment." Valeria sat up, the fatigue still visible in her eyes. "Sure," she answered, touching her side as if checking that her body still responded. "Are you sending me back?" The director sat across, took a breath, and slid the folder toward her. The cover had a discreet seal, not obviously official, but when opened there was a page with Valeria's signature, the report from the previous night, and a short handwritten note. Classified. Forwarded to National Defense. Do not discuss with third parties. Your report wasn't treated like the others, the director began. It's been classified. It's no longer in the regular channels. It went straight to National Defense. Valeria frowned. "Classified?" she repeated. "Why? I just did what any nurse would have tried to do." "That's exactly what makes it different," the director replied gently, still firm. "I can't give you more details about what they already know. What you need to know is this. You must stay available. They'll ask you questions. They may review your file, and you'll wait for instructions. Don't talk about this with anyone outside. Not your shift co-workers. Not your family, nobody." "What if they ask me?" Valeria asked, feeling her professional training bump against the opacity of the situation. "What do I tell them?" "Tell them you followed emergency protocol and have them contact me. Any deviation creates unnecessary noise. They handle the information. You just report the basic facts if asked and wait." The director looked her in the eye. "This isn't a punishment, Valeria. It's caution. What you did could have changed a lot, and now you're part of something bigger than what you see." Valeria turned the page. The top of the report had her name, the rescue log, times, even a brief note about the knocks on the sealed door. In the margin, in a different handwriting, someone had written, "Critical intervention. Reserved follow-up." No explanation, just a confidential stamp and a series of numbers that meant nothing to her yet. "Will I get a copy?" she asked, looking for something concrete to hold on to amid the vagueness. "This is your working copy," the director said. "Don't lose it. It's marked, and it must not leave this place without explicit permission. People will call you. If they ask for details, redirect them to me. If they ask you to sign something, do it, but don't add comments unless they ask for them." Valeria tucked the folder away carefully, as if the paper carried extra weight. She was trying to process that what had been, in her mind, an urgent decision during a fire was now under an official cover that made her feel both watched and strangely protected. "And the woman?" she asked quietly. "Do you know what happened to her after?" The director didn't answer right away. She stared at a point on the wall, as if weighing how much she could say. "All I know is she was transported carefully, and her case didn't follow the usual route. I can't tell you more. Stay alert, rest what you can, and wait," she repeated. "I'll let you know when there's something you need to do." Valeria nodded. Her mind held a mix of appreciation for the partial clarity and frustration over what remained hidden. She stood slowly. "I understand." Her voice sounded firmer than she felt. "I'll do what you ask." The director stayed a moment longer, then leaned forward and looked down at a small folded note on the side of the folder that hadn't been opened. "This came with instructions to give it to you now," she said, handing over the envelope. "Open it only when you're alone." Valeria took the envelope carefully. She didn't open it then. She slipped it inside her coat, near her heart, like a quiet reminder that she was on a line of tension between what she had done and what was coming. Before leaving, the director looked at her again. "You're not alone in this," she said with a slight nod. "But you can't speak about it freely. That's all for now." Valeria watched her go. The hallway outside was lit by soft lights and the muffled murmur of the night shift. She sat a moment with the folder on her lap, breathing, trying to understand how far she had gone in a night that started like any other. The next days were a strange mix of going back to work and feeling like everything was slightly off. Valeria did her shift, cared for patients, did rounds, but part of her mind stayed glued to the folder the director had given her. The page stamped confidential was still in the inner pocket of her coat. She hadn't opened it. She kept it close like a quiet reminder that she was now involved in something she didn't fully understand. The folded envelope from the meeting was still sealed too. Sometimes she could feel it warm, as if whatever was inside matched the unsettled feeling in her chest. In a short break between exams, she used the computer to check her file in the electronic system. She logged in with her usual credentials and the second-factor authentication, which now felt like a more careful ritual. The cursor blinked and her history appeared. The Fire Night intervention, the report she'd signed, the director's notes, and something else. There were new recent entries with stamps that didn't show up on her paper copy. Opening the section labeled Follow-up Evaluation, she saw parts blacked out. Places where there should have been text, names, or references were replaced with dark bars reading, redacted, over and over. On another line, where the patient transfer should have been described, was a short phrase, critical intervention, reference to mobile protocol. Next to it was another tag, see at higher level. Valeria frowned and tried to scroll further. The system wouldn't let her expand certain fields. When she tried, a small red warning appeared, restricted access, authorized contact required. Her first instinct was to reach for the folder to find the number she was supposed to direct questions to and remember the instruction. If they ask for details, route everything to me. She couldn't shake the fact that her own name was there, uncensored, while the surrounding pieces, mentions of protocols, a special oversight, note in the margin, and a timestamp showing access that wasn't hers, made her feel the invisible presence of other hands. She decided not to sit with the doubt. She went down to medical records and asked to see the system support person, a young woman named Lydia who had helped before with minor glitches. Lydia met her with a mix of friendliness and caution. "What's up, Valeria?" she asked as they went into a small room with a more secure terminal. "I want to understand this," Valeria said, pointing at the screen. "I see the file was updated, but parts are blurred, censored. What aren't they showing me?" Lydia typed quickly, pulled up the access history, and showed it. "Your file was reviewed by an authorized group last night," she explained. "There's a note that says supervised review, confidential, and the access came from an account that isn't publicly visible. That means someone with special permission saw it, but you don't get details. Do you want me to escalate it?" "Can I?" Valeria asked carefully, not wanting to sound like she was trying to break the unspoken rule she'd heard in the isolated room. "I can file it as a formal request, but there's a warning here that says you can't push it up without going through the chain they already told you. If you poke too much, it might trigger a tracking alert," Lydia warned, lowering her voice. Valeria swallowed. "I just want to know if my name is at risk, if I did something wrong. I don't like feeling watched and not knowing why." Lydia looked at her for a moment and nodded. "I believe you, but for now, don't feed it. If you get something official, I'll help push it." She left with more questions than answers. In the hallway, she almost ran into a man standing just past the corner. She saw him turn his head like he was watching her from a distance, but when she locked eyes, there was no one. Only the movement of a stretcher passing and a tech with a flashlight. The feeling that someone was following her, or at least monitoring her, stuck to her skin. Later, in the short break before her next round, she pulled out the envelope the director had given her. She held it, felt it gently, but still didn't open it. She took a sip of cold coffee. The clock ticked slowly. She thought about the call from the night before. The grateful voice that didn't ask for anything. Was that the same person the men had referred to? Was there more the director knew but wasn't saying? She rubbed her temple with the back of her hand, the tension between her brows forming a line. The electronic file kept hanging over her like a shadow. Censored data, unexpected reviews, and a record that her action had rippled beyond her normal scope. She couldn't deny feeling part of something, and she didn't know if that meant protection or a quiet sentence. But if she'd learned anything from that night in the isolated room and in the director's office, it was that patience was survival. For now, she wouldn't push further than necessary. She stowed her phone, straightened her coat, and went into the emergency area with a blend of forced calm and alertness that had become her second skin. A couple of days passed with a routine mixed with a quiet tension of things left unsaid. Valeria was back on shift, but the feeling of being in a scenario with hidden pieces didn't leave her. She had learned to walk between the explicit and the covert, smile at patients, write only the minimum required in charts, answer calmly when someone asked how she was, and keep the confidential folder the director gave her locked in the drawer of her locker. That afternoon, just as the shift was starting to settle a little, she felt a presence behind the central nursing station. It wasn't noise. It was a gesture. Someone stood 2 steps away, eyes fixed on her, but not moving, like someone who didn't want to draw attention. "Valeria Ramos," said a low, measured voice. Not really a question. She turned and saw a middle-aged man in a simple but well-tailored dark suit, no glasses, hair graying at the temples. He had no visible ID or badge. He looked more like a courier than someone looking for trouble. In his hand, he held a small box wrapped with black ribbon, no logos or labels. He set it gently on the counter and leaned forward slightly. "This came for you," he added. "They say open it when you're alone." Valeria watched him. Her professional instinct searched for an explanation. "Who sent it? Was it a mistake?" "Who sent it?" she asked, approaching the package carefully. He didn't smile, but he wasn't cold either. "Just say it was from R," he replied, holding her gaze for a moment as if reading something in her expression. Then he stepped back and added, "Don't do anything rushed. No one else should see it." Before she could press for more, he turned and disappeared down the hall, soundlessly, as if he had faded on purpose. Valeria was left with the box in front of her, feeling the weight of the silence around it. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a small wooden box, smooth, unadorned, with an old hinge that barely creaked when she opened the lid. Inside lay a metal medallion, no ribbon, no visible inscription on either side. Just a dull sheen as if it had been polished many times, and a folded brown envelope with an elegant R drawn in black ink on the outside. The medallion rested on a black cloth cushion. When she picked it up between her fingers, she noticed it was warm, like its temperature responded to touch. There was no logical explanation, but she almost felt human warmth in that small circle of metal. Valeria glanced at the envelope. The R wasn't an ordinary signature. The stroke was confident, ending in a small upward curl, like a promise or a preemptive thank you. She turned the medallion over in her palm, looking for a mark, but found nothing that explained where it came from or why. From outside came the usual murmur of the emergency room, but all the noise felt muffled. Valeria breathed deeply. She didn't open the letter right away. She knew that what came after she opened it would probably change how she saw herself in the chain of things that had begun the night of the fire. The resident working nearby, a young doctor sorting supplies, noticed and came over casually. "All good?" he asked, with a half-smile that said, "Did something weird happen?" "I got something," she replied, her voice neutral. "I'll check it later." He nodded, said nothing more. Valeria left the closed box to the side, covered it with her hand for a few seconds, then stood to continue her rounds, feeling the medallion in the room like a weight that was both strange and quietly reassuring. It wasn't an order, not a threat. It was a silent recognition, a contained thank you, and the R on the envelope was a clear sign that the voice from the call the other night was present in some way, still not speaking directly. When her shift ended, she stayed a while longer in the small room where she sometimes took brief breaks between patients. She carefully took out the envelope and held it in her hand, the smell of the old paper mixed with the coffee still in her thermos. She could have opened it right there, but she chose to wait until she was alone, as the unspoken suggestion had implied. The medallion sat beside her, catching a faint light that seemed to shift with the movement of shadows in the hallway. That night, when things had finally quieted and the shift had softened into slow footsteps and low voices, Valeria was alone in the small room where she kept her things. The medallion was in her hand. She still hadn't opened the letter. The light was dim, and the hallway noise came through like a distant murmur. She took a breath, and with hands still trembling from the built-up tension, slid the envelope with the R toward her. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet, written in clear, steady handwriting, though some strokes turned sharper as if the writer had hesitated before choosing certain words. At the end was a short but powerful paragraph. The letter read, "Valeria, I have no way to thank you enough. In that room, at that moment, you chose not to look away. You rescued me from something that was not an accident or just a fire. What I was protecting was not an ordinary file. It was the key to expose a network that, if blown wide open, would have killed many and taken me out. That's why they hid me. That's why they put me under another name. And that's why, when the fire started, there were already people coming for me. You gave me air. You gave me time. You gave me a way out when everything was closing in. That changed the plan of those who wanted to silence me. Thank you for not leaving me behind. I can't tell you everything. If this paper falls into the wrong hands, it drags you too. Trust what you saw. The door, the knocks, the weight of the inevitable. If someone ever asks you about me, and you need a word to prove this isn't a trap, say, the light doesn't go out with smoke. Those who should will understand. I owe you more than a medallion can carry. Keep it. Don't show it. And if you ever need a sign, look for a sheet of red ink folded like simple origami. With respect and debt, R. Valeria read it once, then again. The lines unfolded with a mix of clarity and mystery. It wasn't an accident. They were coming for me. It changed the plan of those who wanted to silence me. Everything fit at the edge of what she already knew. That the woman wasn't ordinary. That rescuing her had moved pieces others left still. The key phrase at the end, "The light doesn't go out with smoke," stayed in her mind like a quiet password, proof that the voice on the call wasn't a trick or a hallucination. The medallion, no longer just an unnamed object, felt like an unspoken contract. A thank you in metal, a promise that someone knew her name and would remember. She put her hand to her forehead, folded the letter back carefully, and tucked it into her bag close to her heart. She held the medallion a moment longer, turned it between her fingers, then slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat where no one else could see. She felt something shift inside her. It wasn't that she had more facts now. It was that she understood her act was part of a hidden chain of care. She had, unintentionally, triggered a system into motion. She thought about the warning. If someone came looking, she had a word to say without giving too much away. The light doesn't go out with smoke. Who else knew that? Who else could recognize it? She knew it wasn't to be used lightly. She kept the letter as a secret shared between two people who barely knew each other, and allowed herself a quiet moment. In that silence, gratitude for having saved someone who now thanked her in hushed terms mixed with unease over what it meant to have touched a network moving in shadows. When she finally let herself lean back in the chair, the exhaustion hit hard. It wasn't only physical. There was a new, internal vigilance, as if her danger sense now included knowing she was linked to something that could have consequences. The medallion was still warm in her pocket, and the phrase from the letter echoed quietly in her head. There were no more instructions, no explicit promise of help right away, just a committed thank you and the sign that, if needed, there was a way to reach out without speaking aloud. Weeks passed since the night of the fire, and Valeria's rhythm had mostly returned to something like normal, though the quiet tension didn't fully go away. She still felt, on her skin, the sense that someone was watching her, and the nameless medallion stayed in the inside pocket of her coat like a warm secret. She had answered the head nurse's questions, kept up with her routine, and above all, stayed quiet about the details she was told not to share. She didn't complain openly, but the weight of what wasn't said grew like a familiar shadow. One afternoon, while finishing writing vital signs on a chart, she got a different kind of call. This time it wasn't a hidden number. A name showed on the screen she didn't recognize. Officer Ruiz. She answered with the contained calm of someone who had already learned that any notification might mean something out of the ordinary. "Valeria Ramos, right?" A clear, unhurried male voice asked. "I'm Officer Ruiz. You've been referred for an internal recognition. You must appear next Tuesday at the airbase. I'll send you the full address and meeting point. Don't wear a uniform. Comfortable clothes, nothing flashy." He paused briefly, as if making sure she understood. "Bring ID and the folder they gave you." "Internal recognition?" she repeated, not sure whether to sound grateful, cautious, or alert. "Is this about the patient? I can't give you more details over this channel. What they'll ask of you there, you'll know when you arrive. Be on time." The tone left no room for debate. The call ended quietly. Valeria stared at the screen for a moment with the phone in her hand. Internal recognition could mean many things: another formal interview, a security review, or a thank you dressed in neutral language. She told Marco in few words. He nodded without asking. He knew she couldn't say much. Tuesday arrived. Valeria dressed in plain clothes. Dark pants, a simple shirt. Nothing that stood out. She put the sealed folder in a discreet bag and went to the airbase. On the way, she ran through the instructions in her head. No uniform, ID ready, don't say more than necessary. At the entrance, armed guards with vests and glasses checked her name. She waited a few minutes while they verified her information on a terminal. A bespectacled young man, identifying himself as the coordination liaison, approached and led her quickly inside. The base felt calm but tense. There were no large flags or marching guards. It was functional. Gray-walled corridors, soft white lights that didn't glare, and a controlled quiet. Not oppressive, just precise. The liaison walked her down a narrow hallway past several doors with digital locks. At one door she noticed a discreet emblem. Something that vaguely reminded her of initials she'd only heard about indirectly before. She didn't ask. She knew explanations weren't given here. They entered a small room, almost empty. A simple table in the middle, a couple of chairs, and a high window looking out over a runway where, for a moment, she saw a black helicopter standing still in the distance, its rotor stopped. A few people were already there. A man in a dark suit holding a closed folder, a woman wearing an unusual uniform. Not medical, not obviously military, and Officer Ruiz, who gave a slight nod when Valeria came in. "Please sit," Ruiz said calmly. "We'll begin shortly." She sat across from the table. For a few seconds, the room held an awkward silence. It wasn't cold, just expectant. They offered her a small glass of water. The man in the suit said little. The woman glanced at her quickly, assessing, but didn't ask anything directly. "This is a brief procedure," the woman said, "not framed as a welcome. No speeches. You don't need to prepare anything special." She paused and added, "Just wait a moment." Valeria cleared her throat. "What happens next?" she asked, trying to sound relaxed despite her alert body. "You will be given something," Ruiz replied without detail. "That's all you need to know for now." She nodded. The room was plain. There were no visible cameras, but the feeling of being watched remained. Not in a hostile way, but as if every movement mattered in a chain that had to stay precise. She looked down at the folder on her lap, stamped and annotated. Light from the window drew lines across the table. An assistant came in quietly and adjusted something behind a nearby curtain, making the room feel ready without making it obvious what for. Valeria wondered whether that was part of the internal recognition or an additional check. There was no background noise, no outsiders, just them in that small room waiting. The silence in the room wasn't awkward. It was controlled, like every breath was being measured. Valeria sat with the folder still in her lap, feeling that any move could break something delicate. The woman in the different uniform and the man in the suit looked at her for a few more seconds, then stood up without saying anything. Officer Ruiz stepped forward, a thin folder under his arm, and opened a small metal box in front of her. There was no soundtrack or presentation. Nobody broke the quiet with grand words. It was a ceremony where everything that mattered was in what wasn't said. "Valeria Ramos," Ruiz said, voice clear. "Thank you for coming. This is simple and brief." He paused, as if making sure she understood that simple didn't mean weightless. "No speeches. You don't have to explain anything. Just accept this." She nodded, calm but fully focused. The man in the suit opened the box and took out an ID card. Small, matte plastic that didn't glare, with sober lettering. In a box in black and red ink, it read Confidential, Level 2. It didn't come with a public badge or announcement. They slid it carefully across the table in front of her. "This gives you limited access to certain communication and validation channels," the woman without a standard uniform explained. "It's not something you explain. Keep it. If someone asks, say you have it, and follow the instructions you get from the other side." Ruiz held out his hand and gave her the credential. She took it with slightly trembling fingers. Whether from pride, uncertainty, or both, she didn't know. It felt a little cold at first, then warm to her touch. On the back there was no photo, just a code and the label, Confidential, Level 2. There was no explanation of exactly what that level meant or who authorized it. It just sat there, a quiet key. "There's nothing more to say," Ruiz added. "You can go. Stay alert for future instructions." Valeria slid the credential carefully into the folder and stood. Before leaving, she looked at the woman in the uniform and asked, "Does this make me part of something?" The woman didn't smile fully, but her eyes softened. "It makes you recognized. That's enough for now." Then she stood and, with a small gesture, indicated the exit. In the hall on the way out, the air felt different, less tense and more gathered. No one walked her to the door. They let her go alone. Outside, late afternoon light was fading, and in the distance the base looked like any normal operation. Service trucks, staff moving in routine, and a black helicopter parked beyond, still, its rotor slowly lowering. When she was a few steps from the main entrance, the coordination liaison approached quietly and said, "That's it for now. If they call, answer. And guard what you know." She nodded and left. There were no applause, no public recognition, no plaque on the wall. It was a quiet act, as strange as clear. You received something important, Confidential, Level 2, with no announcement to anyone else. The afternoon shift had started like any other. Patients coming and going, routine questions, forms being filled out, tired looks exchanged among staff. Valeria was in the observation room, reviewing a chart, when the familiar sound of footsteps around her gave her a strange sense of normalcy. She had learned to move while staying alert, and to smile like nothing was wrong. The nameless medallion was hidden in the inside pocket of her coat, and the confidential credentials still rested in the folder she kept locked in her locker. She didn't show it. Nothing in the room shouted that she was different from the usual nurse, but something in her chest had shifted. The weight of what she knew wasn't just a confusing burden anymore. It was a quiet part of her story. "Are you okay, Valeria?" asked Mariana, the new aide, coming up with a tray of meds. "Yeah," she replied, without looking up from the chart. "Just a little tired. Bring it when you're done with room 3. Mariana nodded and left. Valeria closed the file with a soft movement and stayed still for a few seconds, staring out the window at the street. The sky was clear, the sun was setting, and it tinted the low city clouds pink. It was an ordinary evening, and yet something made her look up past the window, toward the distant rooftop of the hospital. A low hum grew, barely held back. It wasn't an alarm or a building system. It was a sound she knew well now. The deep whisper of a rotor turning gently above. A black helicopter moved overhead, not very high, not stopping or coming down. Its silhouette cut across the room with purpose, clean, with no visible markings, and its shadow crossed the space for a moment. Valeria smiled without anyone nearby noticing. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve of recognition. She remembered the first time she'd seen that same color on the rooftop. The first encounter with the men, the letter, the credential, the uncertainty. For a second, it all felt lighter. The helicopter didn't pause. It wasn't coming for her. There were no signals or attached messages. It passed like a familiar shadow and kept going, shrinking into the distance until only the faint hum remained, then silence. "Something happen?" asked a resident pushing a stretcher, noticing her gaze toward the sky. "Nothing important," she said, letting the smile stay. "Just felt like things are in their place." He looked at her with a bit of curiosity and moved on. Valeria went back to her folder, noted a medication change for a patient, and wrote it down with steady handwriting. Inside, she knew she didn't need more explanations. The pieces weren't fully resolved, but the helicopter's quiet pass across the sky was like someone saying, "We've seen. You know, keep going." Night was coming. Lights came on in the halls, and the sounds of the hospital shifted tone. Softer, more settled. She took a sip of her cooled coffee, adjusted her mask under her chin, and put the pen away. For a moment she rested her hand on the medallion in her pocket, feeling its round shape without pulling it out. She didn't need it to remember. "Valeria, you've been sent a message to stop by the reports area when you can," called the shift lead from across the hall. "I'm going," she answered, standing slowly. Before she went, she paused and looked once more at the darkening sky, now starting to show faint stars through the window. She smiled again, with a bit of peace. She didn't need any more answers. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and give a like so you won't miss more stories like this one. See you next time!